In the spring of 2019, in the southwest corner of Randolph County, Nebraska, a man named Dale Voss walked the low end of the Hollis farm for the first time. Dale had a soil science degree from the state land-grant university, 11 years as the county extension agent, and the kind of patient certainty that comes from being right about most things. He stood at the fence line above a 40-acre field that sat below the grade of everything around it, ringed by old elms, and he looked at the standing water and the patchy native grass and the soft black mud at the edges, and he said, quietly and not unkindly, that this ground was a drainage problem, that it had always been a drainage problem, that the right call, the sensible call, was to tile it out and put it into production. He said it looking at Wren Hollis, who was 28 years old, and had come back to the farm 8 months earlier after her father died. And he said it the way a person says something to someone who will understand once they think it through. Wren thanked him and did not tile the field. 4 years later, in the fall of 2022, Margaret Pruitt drove out from the regional NRCS office with a clipboard and a set of field assessments and sat down with Wren at the kitchen table. Margaret had spent 31 years evaluating wetland and pasture systems across the northern plains. She went through the numbers from the prior grazing season, and she went quiet for a moment in the way that people go quiet when a number does not line up with their expectations. Then she set the clipboard down, and she said slowly that she needed Wren to walk her back through the whole thing from the beginning, because the number in front of her did not happen by accident, and she wanted to understand how it had come to pass. The number was $312 per head, above the county average net margin, on 12 head of Angus cross cattle, from a 40-acre field that the county extension agent had called a drainage problem that nobody had farmed in living memory. This is the story of how that number came to be. Wren Hollis was known for two things in the years before she came home. She was the quietest Hollis in 4 generations, which was saying something, and she could read a piece of ground the way some people read faces. Her father, Eldon, had taught her that. He had farmed the same 280 acres in Randolph County for 41 years, and for 41 years, the low 40 at the southwest end had sat idle, undrained, unfenced for cattle use, unplanted, a field that even longtime neighbors could not quite explain. Eldon had never explained it either. He just left it alone, and when people asked, he said the ground had its reasons, and he had his, and they were the same reasons. When Eldon died in the late winter of 2018, Wren drove back from Lincoln, where she had been doing agricultural consulting work, and she did not leave again for 6 months. The farm felt like the inside of a held breath. She spent the first 2 weeks in his office sorting papers, tax records going back to 1979, soil maps annotated in pencil, a folder of moisture retention calculations done by hand, 3 decades of commodity price clippings, rubber-banded by year. Eldon had not thrown much away. He had also not explained much. His handwriting was small and tilted, and she had always been able to read it. And reading it now in his office with the desk lamp on against the March gray was like listening to a voice in a room after the person had left. In the middle drawer, she found a notebook with a green canvas cover, water-stained at the bottom corner, as though it had been left in the field through a rain more than once. It was filled from cover to cover with 40 years of field observations, rainfall amounts recorded to the 100th of an inch, first and last frost dates, grazing weights by season, notes on which sections recovered fastest after a dry August, careful annotations on the native grass species by their Latin and common names, and occasional longer entries that read less like field data and more like considered opinion. She had seen the notebook before, sitting in the same drawer. She had not read it end to end. She read it that night and most of the following day. On page 114, in an entry dated June of 1987, she found a sentence that her father had underlined twice with a soft pencil, pressing hard enough that the groove was still visible 3 decades later. The words around it were about the grass recovery after a wet June, ordinary field notes. But the sentence he had underlined sat in a different register than the rest. It read, "The wet ground below the elm fence remembers where water has always been. Don't drain it." There was nothing after it, no explanation, no mechanism given, no yield data attached, no reference to any outside source. Just the sentence and the double underline, and the rest of the page blank below it, as if he had written it, and then decided that was all that needed saying. Wren sat with that sentence until the light went out the office window. Then she put on her coat and her boots, and she went out to look at the field. Let me tell you about artesian seeps, because the low 40 at the Hollis farm was one, and understanding what that means is the only way to understand what happened later. An artesian seep is not standing water in the ordinary sense, not water pooling after a rain and evaporating in the heat. It is a place where groundwater under pressure finds its way to the surface through a crack or a permeable layer in the subsoil, and it does this regardless of what the sky is doing. In a county like Randolph, where the geology runs to interbedded sandstone and shale at depth, these seeps can be perennial, meaning they flow or saturate the surface year-round, even in a drought year, fed by aquifer pressure rather than surface rainfall. They are not common. Most farmers who have one do not know what they have because the ground looks wet and soft and unprofitable, and the instinct, reinforced by 100 years of extension advice, is to drain it. What Eldon Hollis had understood and written down in 1987, and apparently told no one, was that the low 40 was not a drainage problem. It was a water source. The elm trees that ringed it had tapped the seep themselves and grown large and old and permanent on that basis. The native grasses inside the fence, big bluestem and switchgrass and prairie cordgrass, were species that had evolved in exactly this kind of perennially moist, high mineral content ground, and they grew tall and dense and rich in the nutrients that shallow-rooted row crops could not access. The mud at the edges was not compacted dead ground. It was mineral-saturated soil that had never been plowed, never been depleted, never been asked to produce anything it was not already producing on its own. What Eldon had not done, and what Wren now began to think about, was figure out how to graze that ground without destroying it. That was the missing half of the calculation. The water was there. The grass was there. The question was whether cattle could use it without turning it into a wallow. Wren came back to the farm in March of 2018 and spent the spring and summer reading everything she could find on managed rotational grazing in wet and riparian pasture conditions. Most of the literature focused on upland dryland pasture. The wet ground research was scattered and cautious, hedged with compaction warnings that assumed saturation meant poor drainage rather than active water from below. She noticed the difference. In July, she drove to a ranch outside Sabetha, Kansas, where a man named Harold had been practicing high-density, short-duration grazing on creek-bottom ground for 15 years. Harold was 61 and thin and wore his hat low and did not explain things without being asked. She arrived in the morning, and he walked her along his creek-bottom strips for 2 hours, and then he sat her on a fence rail at the edge of his best pasture and said, "You want to watch what the grass does when they leave." The grazed strip the cattle had left 40 days before was green and standing 8 inches high again. The soil surface not packed, the dung broken down and visible. She pulled a stem of big bluestem by the roots, and the root came out clean and long. Harold said the root mass was the whole game. Short, hard grazing plus long rest meant the grass spent its recovery, pushing roots down rather than blades up. Deeper roots mined minerals from lower in the soil profile. Higher mineral content in the forage meant better conversion in the animal, less need for supplements. He had cut his mineral supplementation by 70% over 10 years, and his average hanging weights had gone up 11 pounds per head. He said he had the records. She asked about the water. He said the creek bottom was the water. The riparian area was perennially moist from the lateral seep along the banks. The managed grazing kept the plant cover dense enough that evaporation stayed low. And in a drought year, his creek bottom strips stayed green while his upland sections cured early, and he shifted the herd accordingly. He said the wet ground knows more than the dry ground. Tread lightly on it, and it feeds you forever. Wren drove home and ordered a spool of polywire and a box of step-in posts. The principle was not complicated. Put cattle on a small section of wet pasture for 2 to 4 days, move them out, rest the strip for 45 to 60 days. The short duration left dung and trampling that stimulated new growth without compacting the soil. The rest period let the grass push roots deeper. The native grass canopy closed fast enough after each graze to shut out weeds. The cattle put on weight from mineral-rich forage through the grazing season with no supplemental cost. The soil improved rather than declined because the organic matter cycled back through the microbial community. The wet soil kept active. The water came from below. That was the part no drainage manual had accounted for. She was not certain it would work on the Hollis Low 40, but this was a question you answered by trying. In the fall of 2018, she built 5 temporary cross fences inside the Low 40 using polywire and step-in posts, dividing it into rough 5-acre sections. She bought 8 Angus cross calves from a cow-calf operation 2 counties over, haggled briefly on the price, and put them on the first strip on a Tuesday morning in late September. She stood at the fence and watched them graze, Fig sitting beside her boot, in the way he had learned to sit quietly at fence lines. The blue heeler patience that read movement rather than making it. The cattle moved into the tall native grass without hesitation, pulling at the big bluestem and the switchgrass, working methodically in the way cattle work when the forage is good. She moved them every 3 days. She measured the grass recovery at 30 days and again at 60, kneeling in the recovering strip with a ruler and recording the heights in a new notebook with a brown cover. She pulled soil cores and labeled them by date and strip number. She kept records in the same small, tilted notation her father had used, because she had learned to write that way, looking over his shoulder, before she learned to write any other way. Dale Voss came out in April of 2019. Wren had called the extension office with a question about native grass species, and he had offered to come take a look. He was a tall man, slightly narrow through the shoulders, with wire-rimmed glasses and a State University fleece he wore in most weather. He was not dismissive in the way a person is dismissive when they are being careless. He was dismissive the way a person is dismissive when they believe, sincerely and with supporting data, that they already know the answer. He walked the Low 40 for 20 minutes, pulling at the native grass clumps, pressing his boot into the wet soil near the elm fence, consulting a soil survey on his phone. Then he came back to where Wren was standing and said what he said, that this ground was a drainage problem. That tile drainage would cost her approximately $18,000 for the 40 acres. that she could get the field into corn or soybeans within 2 growing seasons, that the county average on comparable ground was running around 180 bushels of corn per acre at current prices. He said the cattle grazing was fine as a stopgap, ma'am, but the field was too wet to graze reliably. He said she was putting expensive calves on a liability. Wren said she had been seeing good recovery on the grass. Dale looked at his phone and said he understood, but the soil structure in saturated ground like this didn't support intensive use. He said her father had left it idle for a reason. She did not tell him what the reason was. If you have spent any time around a farm where one neighbor is doing things quietly and a different neighbor is doing things loudly, you know how the next few years felt. Kurt Phelps farmed the 320 acres east of the Hollis place, and he was a good farmer by any reasonable measure. He was 48, second generation, a round-faced, cheerful man who had put genuine care into building up his operation. In 2019, encouraged by an agronomist from a regional grain cooperative who told him the aquifer pressure in Randolph County was running strong, Kurt financed a center pivot irrigation system for his east 200 acres. The system ran 240 feet in radius and cost him $114,000 on a 7-year note. The agronomist told him it would pay out in yield premium within 4 seasons. You had to respect the logic. Irrigated corn in a normal year outperformed dryland corn by 60 to 80 bushels per acre in that part of Nebraska. The aquifer numbers that spring supported the projection. Kurt drove that pivot with the satisfaction of a man who has made a sound decision based on evidence a credentialed person had reviewed. Meanwhile, Wren moved polywire. She expanded to 12 head in the spring of 2019 and added a 6th strip, giving each section a longer rest period of 55 days. She built a small gravity-fed water trough near the elm fence, set lower than the seep's outlet point so the spring water filled it without a pump. The trough ran full all summer. She did not need to haul water once. She was weighing the cattle on a portable scale at the end of each rotation and writing the numbers in her brown notebook in columns: date, head count, individual weights, average daily gain per rotation period. The gains were steady. Through May and June and into the July heat, 5 pounds per head per day on the best strips, 4.5 on the slightly drier north end where the seep pressure was lower. They were achieved on grass alone from the day she turned the cattle in, until the ground froze in November. No supplemental mineral blocks after the first month, because the forage was covering it. No hay from May through October. No irrigation, no pump, no supplemental feed delivery. Her feed cost per head for 6 months of grazing was the cost of the polywire step-ins she replaced each spring. A bundle of 50 posts ran her $14. That was all. If you have ever kept a tight ledger on a livestock operation, you know what 0 feed cost in a 6-month grazing season means for the margin calculation. You also know how rarely it happens, because most grazed pasture in that part of Nebraska needs supplemental hay or mineral blocks or both, because most grazed pasture is not mineral-saturated native ground fed by a perennial seep. The county average for supplemental feed, cost per cow-calf pair from May through October, was running around $210 that year. Wren was spending $14 on fence posts. If someone had told Dale Voss that number, he would have said the system was unsustainable, and the soil would show compaction within 2 years. He had, in fact, said approximately that. She did not call the extension office to share the results. She wrote them in the brown notebook. If you have run numbers like this and kept them to yourself, while someone with a degree and a fleece and a clipboard told you the ground you were working was a liability, you know how she felt about that. Drop a comment if you do. It's the quietest kind of vindication. The kind that happens in a field before anyone else comes to look. Dale came back in July of 2019, uninvited, because a neighbor had mentioned to him that Wren was still running cattle on that wet ground and he felt he should check in. He walked the strips with her this time, looking at the grazed sections and the recovering sections side by side, and he said he appreciated that the grass was coming back, but he was concerned about soil compaction in the saturated zones near the seep edge. He said it again that day, that ground is a liability, not an asset. He said it standing at the elm fence, looking at 12 fat Angus cross cattle, grazing a strip of native grass in the kind of golden July light that makes everything look better than it is. Wren said the soil cores she had pulled showed no compaction in the rest sections. He said he would want to see that data. She offered to share it. He said that would be helpful, and he would follow up. He did not follow up. She had understood by then that Dale Voss was not going to change his mind through data she had gathered herself. That was not how the calculus worked for him. His model required a third party, a qualified outside voice, before it could update. She was 29 years old, and she had not finished her agronomy degree. She had come back to a farm that everyone in the county knew had sat half fallow for a generation, and she was running cattle on the one field everyone agreed was a problem. She was aware of how that looked. She went back to work. In the late summer of 2019, Wren drove to the NRCS district office and asked if anyone there knew about perennial spring seeps and managed rotational grazing. The woman at the desk gave her a name, Margaret Pruitt, regional wetland and pasture specialist, based 2 counties over. Wren called that afternoon. Margaret came out on a Thursday morning in late September. She was 60, tall, with short gray hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to not perform urgency. She drove down the 2-track to the low 40 in her own truck, got out with a canvas bag over her shoulder, and walked the fence line alone for 40 minutes before she said anything. She pressed her hand against the soil near the seep outlet. She pulled a grass stem and examined the root. She crouched at a recovering strip and looked sideways along the canopy. Then she came back and said she wanted to see the soil cores. Wren had them labeled in jars on the barn shelf, organized by date and strip number going back to 2018. Margaret looked at each one without speaking, holding them to the light, reading the profiles. She noted the absence of compaction in the rest period samples, the consistent dark color through the top 8 inches. She set each jar down carefully and said she would take her own samples before she left. She called 3 weeks later. She said the low 40 showed signs of a functional artesian seep of moderate perennial flow, that the native plant community was in unusually intact condition for a field surrounded by row crop country, and that the managed grazing was enhancing rather than degrading it. She said what Wren was doing was textbook practice for wet meadow ground. She would like to come back for a full assessment. She said, almost as an aside, that she had not seen ground like this managed this carefully in Randolph County in 20 years of site visits. That fall, Wren went back to Eldon's green notebook and read every entry from start to finish. She was looking for the moment he had figured out what the field was, and she did not find it, because he had not written the discovery. He had written only the conclusions, the grass names, the moisture readings, the observation that the elm canopy on the east side was 20 feet taller than any comparable upland stand within 2 miles. The understanding had not arrived as an event. It had accumulated the way his handwriting accumulated across the pages. In an entry from October of 1991, he had written that the problem with advice is that it comes from the average. The average doesn't know what this 40 knows. The years between 2019 and 2022 were the years the gap opened, though you could not have seen it from the road. Kurt's pivot ran beautifully in 2019 and 2020. His yields on the irrigated ground came in at 212 bushels per acre in 2019, which was above the agronomist's projection, and he was pleased. He put in a new grain bin in the fall of 2020. The note payment on the pivot ran just under $17,000 a year, and the yield premium was covering it comfortably. He told Wren at a township meeting in November of 2020 that the aquifer was the best investment he had made in 20 years of farming. Wren had 12 head, averaging 5 pounds of gain per day on the summer grass. She said she was glad it was working out for him. In 2021, Kurt noticed that his irrigation well was pulling harder than it had the year before. The pump ran 8 minutes longer to fill the pivot tank. He mentioned it to his agronomist, who said aquifer levels varied year to year and that the monitoring well in the next township was still within normal range. He said not to worry about it. Kurt's corn came in at 198 bushels per acre that fall. The grain bin he had built the year before was full, and the pivot payment was running on schedule. From where he stood, the operation looked sound. He stopped by Wren's place in November to drop off scrap lumber she had asked about, and he looked out at the low 40, the native grass standing brown in the strips, and said he had to hand it to her for sticking with it. She said she was going to stick with it. He nodded and did not ask why. Wren's cattle went through the winter on hay and came back on grass in May of 2021, heavier than they had gone in. She was running the rotation tighter now, 4 days on each strip and 50 days off, and the native grass was doing something she had read about but not yet seen in her own records. The root mass was deepening measurably. She pulled soil plugs from the rested sections and compared them to cores from the same strips 2 years prior. The big blue stem roots had been 8 to 9 inches deep when she started. They were at 14 inches in the best sections now. 14 inches of root in mineral-saturated wet soil meant the plant was mining a layer most row crops never reached. The forage was becoming more nutritious year over year. The field was not being mined, it was being improved. She wrote the root measurements in her brown notebook by date and strip number. Margaret came out in the fall of 2021 for a 2-day full assessment. She measured the seep flow rate with a small Weir gauge set at the lowest field point and came back with the reading 0.4 gallons per minute, perennial. Consistent and reliable, more than sufficient for a 40-acre root zone. She took soil cores from every strip, documented the plant community species by species, and measured soil carbon at 12 inches in 3 locations. She said the field was functioning as a model managed seep pasture. She said she would like to document it as an NRCS case study. Wren said she would think about it and said it again in the spring when Margaret followed up, and eventually said yes in the summer of 2022. Dale Voss stopped by in October of 2021. There had been a meeting of the County Agricultural Advisory Board, and someone had mentioned the Hollis operation, and he had been curious enough to drive out. He stood at the gate of the low 40 and looked at the cattle on the far strip, fat and calm in the October light, and he said he had to admit the cattle were looking well, but he still had reservations about the long-term soil impact. He said that ground was a drainage problem, waiting to happen. He said it with less certainty than he had said it in 2019 or in that July of the same year, but he said it. Wren said she had not had a drainage problem yet. Dale said sometimes it takes a dry year to surface the real issues. He would turn out to be right about the dry year. He would turn out to be wrong about everything else. The summer of 2022 came in dry. June brought 2 inches total against the historical average of 5. July brought less than an inch, and the inch it brought came in a single storm that ran off the baked upland ground rather than soaking in. By the first week of August, the county's soil moisture monitoring station was reading 40% of normal across the upland fields. Kurt turned his pivot on in the 3rd week of June and left it running. The pump ran 8 hours a day, then 10. In the last week of July, it started cycling off before the tank was full, meaning the aquifer below the casing was not recharging fast enough to keep pace with the draw. Kurt called the well service company. They dropped the pump intake 12 feet deeper into material that was still saturated. This bought him 2 weeks. The agronomist called in early August and said this was an exceptional year and the aquifer would recharge over the winter with snowmelt. He said to keep irrigating what Kurt could and let the most marginal ground go. The loan payment on the pivot was due in September regardless of the corn. By August 15th, 2 neighbors on the same aquifer zone had seen their domestic wells go soft. Kurt pulled back his irrigation schedule to 6 hours a day and watched his corn stand wilt between runs. The low 40 held. Wren's field looked in August of 2022 exactly as it had looked in June. The elm trees were deep green. The native grass on the rested strips was recovering at the same pace it recovered in a wet year. The water trough near the elm fence, gravity-fed from the seep, was full and cold. She had not touched the float valve all summer. The seep flowed at 0.4 gallons per minute in wet springs, and it flowed at 0.4 gallons per minute in the driest July-August on record since 1988. It came from pressured sandstone at a depth the county's irrigation wells did not reach. Wren moved polywire on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of August, stepping the post in while the herd grazed the near end with the steady attention of cattle that have learned the rotation. She wrote the date in her brown notebook, and the air temperature, 91 degrees, and the grass height on the recovering strip, 7 inches at 30 days of rest, the same as June. She noted that the trough was full. She closed the notebook. At the County Agricultural Advisory Board meeting in September, she heard what had happened to the surrounding farms. Kurt's irrigated corn stand had come in at 138 bushels per acre on his driest ground, 38% below his prior 2-year average. His total irrigation cost for the summer, including the pump service and the additional fuel to run the system at reduced efficiency, had come to just over $44,000. He sat in the back of the meeting room and did not say much. The agronomist from the grain cooperative gave a presentation about the exceptional nature of the summer's drought and said conditions were expected to normalize. Kurt found Wren in the parking lot after the meeting. The lights over the lot were on because it was past 8 o'clock, and the gravel was still warm from the day even in September, and there were other farmers filing out around them who nodded and moved on. Kurt was a big man, and he looked tired in the way that people look tired after a bad summer, not just sleepy, but ground down. He said he had been driving past the Hollis place twice a week all summer on his way to town, and every time he drove past, the low field looked the same. He said it looked the same in August as it looked in May, and he said he didn't understand how that was possible. She told him about the seep. She explained what an artesian seep was and where the water came from and why it ran at the same rate regardless of what the sky was doing. She told him about the native grass species and what their roots were doing in the mineral-saturated soil. She explained the rotation strips and the 50-day rest, and why the field had been getting better for 4 years instead of compacting. It took 10 minutes in the parking lot. The whole explanation fit in 10 minutes because the mechanism was not complicated once you knew what you were looking at. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at a point about 3 feet in front of his boots, while she talked, nodding occasionally. And when she finished, he stood there for a little longer before he said anything. He said his grandfather had farmed a low corner on the south end of the Phelps ground that nobody in the family had touched since the 1960s. He said the old man had called it different. He said the old man had gone to his grave saying the low corner was different, and you left it alone, and Kurt's father had tiled it out in 1974 and put it into alfalfa, and the alfalfa had done poorly, and they had eventually let it go back to weeds, and Kurt himself had extended the tile main into it in 1998 and planted corn and got 2 mediocre stands in a row before giving up on it and leaving it in grass that was not particularly good grass. He said he had always assumed the ground was just poor. He said quietly that he had assumed his grandfather was being sentimental. She said her father had felt the same thing about this field and had not explained it to anyone. She said she had found it written in a notebook in a desk drawer. He said after a pause that his grandfather's notes were probably in a box in the barn that he had never opened. She said she hoped so. Margaret Pruitt drove out on the first Friday of October, 2022. She arrived at 8 in the morning with a clipboard and a thick manila folder that contained the formal NRCS field assessment she had been developing since 2021, updated through the end of the summer grazing season. She knocked on the door, and Wren let her in and put coffee on the stove. Wren's harvest figures from the summer were already in her brown notebook, written up in the column format she had used since 2018. 12 head through the season, 5 full rotations from May through late September, 0 supplemental feed cost from the day the cattle went on grass until the last rotation ended. Average daily gain during the peak summer rotation, July through August, was 4.9 pounds per head per day, which she had calculated from the portable scale weights she took at each strip transition. She had sold 10 head at the local sale barn the week prior. The average hanging weight was 187 pounds per head. The county average hanging weight for comparable Angus cross cattle, which Margaret had pulled from the state livestock reporting data before she drove out, was 149 pounds per head. They sat at the table. Margaret opened the folder and laid out the assessment in order: soil carbon measurements, native plant community data, seep flow rate, 3-year root depth progression, and then the livestock performance numbers. She worked through each section methodically without editorializing. Then she got to the margin figures. The county average net margin per head, accounting for supplemental feed, mineral inputs, hay, and any interest on livestock notes, was running at $127 for the most recent completed year. Wren's net margin per head, calculated on 0 summer feed cost, no irrigation infrastructure, no pump expense, no hay from May through October, and the premium hanging weight at sale was $439. Margaret set the clipboard down on the table. Fig, Wren's blue heeler, got up from under the table where he had been sleeping and walked slowly across the kitchen floor and lay back down against the far wall, and the sound of his nails on the linoleum was the only sound in the room for a long moment. Margaret looked at the numbers on the page. She looked at them the way a person looks at a figure that does not conflict with the data, but does conflict with what they expected the data to mean. Then she said she needed Wren to walk her back through the whole thing from the beginning. The number above the county average was $312 per head. On 12 head, From a 40-acre field, the county extension office had called a drainage problem from a piece of ground that nobody in Randolph County had farmed in living memory because the conventional read on it was that it was a liability. Margaret said she had been doing this work for 31 years. She said that number was not supposed to happen on ground designated as a wetland drainage issue in the county soil survey. It was not a marginal outperformance, not a good year on otherwise average land. It was a system functioning correctly over 4 consecutive years, on purpose, because of a decision that had been called wrong by the credentialed standard of the county since the first day someone looked at the low 40 and saw wet ground rather than what it actually was. She said she wanted to write it up formally as a case study and present it to the NRCS regional office, and she wanted Wren's permission to do that. Wren said she would think about it. She did not tell Margaret how many times Dale Voss had said the word liability in conversations about that field. She did not need to say it. Margaret was looking at the same field from the inside of a document that did not use that word anywhere. Dale Voss heard about the assessment numbers in November through a contact at the county agricultural office who had seen the preliminary summary that Margaret had filed. He called Wren on a Monday and asked if he could come out. He did not explain why. She said yes. He came on a Wednesday morning when the sky was low and gray and the temperature was in the low 30s, and the native grass on the low 40 was the brown gold of November, standing stiff in the strips where she had moved the cattle out for the last time in late October. He parked at the gate and he walked the field alone, the same fence-line circuit he had walked the first time in April of 2019, with the same slow, unhurried pace. He did not pull at the grass this time or press his boot into the soil. He walked and he looked. He was out there for about 30 minutes. When he came back to the gate, she was standing with her hands in her jacket pockets and Fig was at her feet. Dale took his glasses off and cleaned them on the front of his fleece, a thing she had noticed he did when he was composing a sentence carefully. He put them back on. He said plainly that he had been wrong. He said he had walked the field in 2019 and applied the standard assessment protocol for saturated soils in Randolph County. And that protocol was built on the assumption that saturated soil in this region was saturated because of poor drainage, not because of a perennial subsurface water source. He said the protocol had been developed for common conditions, and the low 40 was not a common condition. And if he had asked what the water source was rather than assuming he knew, he would have understood that in the first visit. He said he did not have another managed seep grazing operation in the county that he knew of, which he now understood was an information gap rather than evidence that the practice was unsound, and he said he would like to bring the Extension Advisory Group out in the spring to see the rotation system in practice if she was willing. She said they were welcome to come. He nodded. He stood there for a moment without saying anything else. She was not interested in extending it. He was not a bad man, and she had never thought he was. He had applied the right tool to the wrong situation and said so plainly on a gray Wednesday morning when he didn't have to come out at all. That was the correct and complete shape of what had happened. She was not interested in anything beyond the plainness of it. Word moved the way it moves in agricultural communities, which is slow and certain and does not require anyone to announce it. By March of 2023, 4 neighbors had come by or called asking about the rotation system. Dale brought the Extension Advisory Group out in April, as he had said, 6 people in county vehicles who walked the field with Wren for 2 hours on a cool spring morning while Fig worked the fence line. She answered their questions in short sentences. She showed them the soil cores organized by year. She showed them the root depth progression. She did not tell them what to do with the information. She let them look at it. She walked Kurt through the system first in January of 2023 at his kitchen table, because he had been paying close attention since the parking lot conversation, and he had a natural low area on the south end of his own east ground, the one his grandfather had called different and his father had tiled out in 1974. The tile drain on that section had been failing for years, backing up in wet springs and requiring expensive jetting to clear, and Kurt had been carrying the maintenance cost without much to show for it. He said he had been wondering what would happen if he just stopped repairing it. Wren walked him through the strip fencing and the polywire system and the rest period timing and the soil monitoring. She explained what the root deepening looked like at each stage and what it meant for forage quality. She went through the feed cost math slowly, showing the column in her brown notebook where the supplemental feed cost ran to zero from May through October and did not come back until November hay. She gave him a photocopy of the relevant pages from Eldon's green notebook. The entries about the elm fence and the native grass and the water that had always been there. He read the notebook pages at the table, with his coffee going cold beside him. He said, after a while, that this was his grandfather's kind of farming. He said he had spent 30 years thinking that kind of farming was sentiment. She said it was not sentiment. She said it was observation, which was a different thing. He nodded. He looked at Eldon's handwriting on the page, and he nodded again. By the summer of 2023, Kurt had capped the failing tile drain on the low corner and built 4 polywire strips across it. He put 6 head of Angus cross cattle on the first strip in May and moved them at 3 days. The ground responded the way wet meadow native soil responds when you take the drainage pressure off and let the moisture profile stabilize. Slowly, over weeks, the grass that had been sparse and weed-invaded since 1974 began to show the native species coming back in from the margins. Prairie cordgrass, a few stems of switchgrass in the wettest corner, big blue stem along the higher edge. It would take years to establish what the Hollis Low 40 had taken 40 years to preserve, but the structure was there in the soil, the seed bank was there in the margins, and Kurt was taking samples every 60 days and recording them in a notebook he had started for the purpose. His well was recovering from the 2022 drawdown at a rate the county well service said was normal for aquifer recharge following a drought year. He had pulled the pivot schedule back on the 2 center-east circles, reducing his summer draw by about 30% on Margaret's recommendation, accepting a lower yield in exchange for not pulling the aquifer down again the next dry year. He did not like reducing the yield. He understood why he was doing it. He was watching the cattle on the wet strips the way Wren had watched hers in the beginning, with the close measuring attention of someone learning a system that operates on a time scale the county extension manual does not track. Margaret's NRCS case study was completed and submitted to the regional office in early 2024. It documented the Hollis Low 40 as a functioning artesian seep grazing system with measurable soil carbon improvement, native plant community stability, and livestock performance metrics, 3 years running above the county average. It named the field observation from Eldon Hollis's 1987 notebook as the operational insight that preserved the resource. The regional soil health coordinator sent Wren a letter that spring asking if she would be willing to host a field day for agricultural producers across 3 counties. She said she would think about it. She said yes a week later. Wren gave Kurt a copy of the brown notebook in the fall of 2023, the one she had been keeping since 2018. She kept Eldon's green notebook in her father's desk where she had found it, in the middle drawer, laid flat with the water-stained corner facing out. She had added a note to the inside front cover, in her own small, tilted handwriting. Wren Hollis, 2024. She did not underline it. There was no need. On the morning of the field day in June of 2024, Fig lay in the shade of the old elm fence, while 23 farmers from 3 counties walked the low 40 and asked questions. Wren answered in short sentences. She showed them the rotation strips and the soil cores and the recovery measurements and the native grass by name. She showed them the trough fed by the seep, full and cold and clear in a dry June, the kind of dry that made people in that county look at their water tables and think carefully. Margaret stood at the back of the group and watched, and at one point she caught Wren's eye and gave a small nod. The kind of nod that passes between people who read the same long document at the same kitchen table and did not need to say anything more about it. The low 40 has never been drained. It does not need to be. The water comes from below, and it has been coming from below since before anyone in Randolph County kept records of such things. Eldon Hollis knew that, and he wrote it down, and he left the field alone for 40 years until someone came home who could read what he had written and understand what it meant. There are 2 kinds of knowledge about a piece of ground. One kind comes from the average, the county-wide data, the extension manual, the yield projections for a soil type that looks like what you are looking at. It is wide knowledge, useful across many places, often right and wrong in the particular ways that matter most when the ground in front of you is not average ground. The other kind is what Eldon had. Narrow, patient, specific to one fence line, and one low field in one corner of one county, accumulated over 4 decades of walking the same 40 acres in wet years and dry years, and writing down what did not change. The conventional eye saw a drainage problem. The notebook saw where water has always been. What is rigid in its categories breaks when the category meets a fact it cannot hold. What is patient and specific and grounded in the 40 you can see from your kitchen window holds when everything else draws down. That is not nostalgia. It is not sentiment. It is arithmetic. $312 per head in a drought year, from a field the county wrote off before Wren was born. Fig still sleeps under the elm fence in the summer mornings when the light comes in sideways and the grass is wet at the roots and you can hear the water moving just below the surface of the soil. That is where the water has always been.